Scott Morrison has slammed a chairman of one of the major lenders as the war of words heats up over the new bank tax.
Ken Henry is now chairman of the National Australia Bank, and he says bank customers will end up paying most of the $1.5 billion raised by the tax each year.
We really have no option but to pass most of this levy on to customers.
The banks are out there today saying without any hesitation, without any fear of Turnbull, they're going to pass it on.
It's not as if the banks are sitting on a pile of money that they can hand across to the government without it having some impact.
He knows as well as I do that the banks can well afford to pay this.
Big bank chairman Ken Henry says, don't have us pay more tax. That's not hardly a surprising headline.
Oh, I've been shaking. I love it when you go crazy. You take all my inhibitions. Baby, there's nothing holding me back.
Ken Henry is welcome to his view.
In my view, the tax is bad policy.
Look, he's talking his own book, right? He's the chairman of a bank.
I'm sure Ken will continue to talk his book.
But on top of that, the process has been a bad process.
There won't be much that a Liberal government can do that Ken Henry will be happy with.
It's a policy which is reminiscent of the sorts of taxes that we had in Australia before the big tax reform started in 1983, and you have to go that far back to find a tax similar to this.
Baby, there's nothing holding me back. You take me places that tear up my reputation, manipulate my decisions. Baby, there's nothing holding me back.
You can agree or disagree with somebody like Ken Henry on any particular matter, but he's a distinguished Australian who served his country well.
You think perhaps the country's going backwards in an economic policy sense?
I do indeed, yeah.
When Ken was Treasury Secretary, he had actually advocated a tax on bank deposits. Now, we don't think a tax on pensioners' bank accounts is a good idea.
It's certainly most unbecoming for the Treasurer to do that to somebody like Ken Henry.
Nor did we think his suggestion about a mining tax was a particularly good idea either. One of the reasons it turned out not to be a good idea is it actually didn't raise any money.
People should be able to participate in the political debate in Australia without that sort of personal attack from the Treasurer.
Baby, there's nothing holding me back.
OK, well, the government's trying a whole variety of approaches in its argument with the banks. We'll start with the velvet glove. Here's the Treasurer, Scott Morrison.
I have this invitation for the banks today. When it comes to their threats against the Australian community, the first bank, I think, to break ranks and say, no, we're not going to insult the Australian people. We're going to do the right thing by the Australian people. Then I think they will get a lot of support from Australian customers. And if the other banks don't want to follow them, then I'd be following the bank that is the first to move.
OK, Catherine, how do you think the soft diplomacy's going?
Well, nice try, obviously. The government's playing a divide and conquer, or attempting to play a divide and conquer strategy with the banks, and the government also feels as though it's on firm political ground because everyone hates the banks, so, you know, it's all good. It hasn't shown any great signs of success, you'd have to say, at this
early
early
stage. Even if the bank said, we won't pass it on, who's going to believe them?
There's also, but on that point, there's a bit of an inconsistency of the government argument here, because the fact is they're saying this is a really good competition measure.
Precisely.
But it's only a competition measure. If they pass it on, then people actually have a reason to walk.
Yeah. Correct.
But at the same time, you've got the government saying don't pass it on.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that this is it kind of indicates that it is, as Anna Bligh and the banks think, a measure that came very late in the piece. That said, it's outrageously popular, isn't it?
Well, the other problem they've got too is, you know, Senator Xenophon's talking about the prospect of putting it on foreign banks, but they're making the argument linking it to the banking guarantee. Well, you can hardly link this to the banking guarantee if you put it on foreign banks that aren't underwritten by the banking guarantee.
Yeah, we'll come back to the foreign bank question, but on the point of inconsistency too, isn't it inconsistent to say that Ken Henry's just talking his book, right? It's self-interest at work. It was only 6 weeks ago that Scott Morrison was saying to the business community, why don't you come out and join the argument for company tax cuts?
Yes.
Well, aren't we then entitled to say, but you're just talking your book, that's just self-interest. Yeah. It's kind of meaningless. Now, Anna Bligh, who, we'll get to Anna Bligh in a moment. Rod Sims has been, from the ACCC, has been asked to, well, I'm not quite sure precisely what his brief is, but keep an eye on things. Here he is.
Of course, we don't have a power to stop the banks doing anything, but I think the fact that we're looking and have an obligation to report publicly will have an effect on their behaviour.
Okay, does that have a lot of value? He says straight up, I haven't got the power.
But he does have the power to go poking around in their private mail. He can call for private emails and all sorts of correspondence. So there is a bit of a sense of, I mean, the idea is to look for collusion in rate setting outside of the
But he can't do, no matter what he finds, you can't do much about it other than publicly shame, I suppose.
Yeah, true. But also on collusion, like, I mean, they've already said they're going to pass it on. Like, I mean, if that's collusion, they've already done it. So we're going to pay through the neck. What I thought was interesting about Ken Henry was how he was likening it to the financial institutions duty, which was precisely 0.06%. That one was on deposits as opposed to this one being liabilities. But, you know, it doesn't mean a bugger for customers. You're still going to have to pay for it.
Personally, I want to see a Rod Sims meme take off, like the Sean Spicer in the bushes meme. I want to see Rod Sims' little head in the bushes
popping
take
up
off.
everywhere.
Absolutely. Hello, here I am. Hello.
Yeah, with the binoculars. OK, now Anna Bligh, who's head of the Bankers Association, of course, she was talking here about the insistence on the government's part that they sign a confidentiality agreement before they're shown the legislation. She said that a bad tax has now become a secret tax. The government made it illegal now. They've made it illegal to test the bill in public. Well, this is what the Treasurer and the Prime Minister says of that.
She works for the big banks, but she also works for the smaller banks who don't seem to be getting a voice through the ABA at the moment.
That's very conventional practice. This is a process of consultation and it is done at this stage confidentially, but obviously the legislation when it's will be published as an exposure draft and then of course presented into the Parliament. So there's no issues of confidentiality there.
Now, Nick Xenophon was complaining too about the fact they haven't seen the legislation, but then the Prime Minister says, well, once we've had our discussions with the banks and we'll draw it up, you'll all get to see it in plenty of time. Is that reasonable?
Well, it's all happening very quickly because they need to get this in place by July 1. So they're saying we have to rush this. I think it's sort of mildly amusing that there's this secrecy around it when the leak that occurred, the apparent leak that occurred, didn't come from the banks sector. It came from somewhere associated with the government. So the leaking problem hasn't really been on the bank side, but that's obviously what they're worried about.
Is this an issue, though, for the crossbenchers? It'll be very late in the piece when they get to see it.
Well, the consultation, there'll be a closed circle of consultation, as it were. And I suppose the government's argument on the confidentiality issue is that it does cut both ways, that the banks can't sort of go to third parties and test the proposal, but whatever flaws that the banks might identify with the legislation also won't be talked about. So I guess there's some merit from the government's perspective. From a process perspective, no, they're going to sit around in this circle, try and come to terms or go to war, and this legislation will hit the decks and the crossbenchers will be, will get on with it.
It also puts the crossbench in a really great position because the government will be desperate to get this through pretty quickly. Because it is July 1. We've only got a couple of weeks left of the Senate. So we're already hearing that, Nick Xenophon wants it on foreign banks. You're going to have you're going to have a whole shopping list of things and the government will have to tick them off.
I mean, up until now, the government's clearly got the negotiating hand on all of this because, as you say, it's a popular tax, you would think. But now the dead cat that didn't emerge on budget night, nobody was talking about the foreign banks. Now everybody is. Here's the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen.
When the banks raise the issue of foreign banks, I think that's a legitimate issue for consideration. If the government says it's about competition, why are big foreign banks exempt that are operating in Australia? They're competing with Australian banks. It could be called reverse protectionism.
Well, the big four banks are asking for an increase expansion of the bank levy to foreign banks. Is that something you consider? Well, no. What we are doing is delivering on the commitment we made in the budget.
I'm not going to rule it in or out other than to say consultations are occurring and in the next sitting fortnight you'll see the legislation that has been well thought through and, as I've said, any good ideas along the way we'll look at.
So a very unconvincing no from the Prime Minister and a maybe from the Assistant Treasurer.
Yeah, no didn't sound like it quite meant no there, so that wasn't very clear. And they will have to junk their argument about it being related to the banking guarantee if they do go ahead.
Well, and
and
there's
put it
also
on
another issue, though. There's another practical issue. I know it's very popular at the moment to rain down scorn on foreign whatevers, but the reality is foreign banks are in Australia to try and boost competition. That's the purpose. That's why they're here. part of this measure, or the justification for this measure, is to boost competition. Now, if this tax is going to flow from the big four banks to the foreign banks, who are not as big as the big four banks, then there's competitive implications associated with that. So again, the policy rationale for doing this is sort of gets thrown up in the air. But you know, the government's going to have to cut whatever deal it can, because the government needs the cash. At the end of the day, that's what this is about.
Yeah.